Thank you, gentlemen. So what I'm just going to quickly ask you if you could introduce yourself, as my introduction was terrible. Apologies for that. So if you could just briefly introduce yourself and then maybe a short comment on anything that stands out for you from the report. These gentlemen have actually seen the report, so it's not just the presentation they're relying on. Is there anything that stands out, something that's missing? Just one thing. So Angus, could I start with you, please?
Angus Murray. So I left oil and gas about 2 years ago. Before that I worked for TACA. Somehow everybody's changed all the acronyms since I left, so I don't actually know OG. They've taken all the OGs out of everything, so I'm trying to work out who's who actually. But so yeah, I work for SSE. So SSE's split into 7 divisions. I'm CIO for Renewables, Thermal and EPM. So Renewables is all our onshore and offshore wind farms, development and operations, and hydro in Scotland. Thermal is our power stations, so Peterhead and others. So we're doing a number of carbon capture and hydrogen projects there as well. And EPM is our energy trading division. So yeah, trying to work out how to actually predict the weather and know how to trade off the energy that we're creating on the wind. I'm also, from previous, I'm also a member of the Technology Leadership Board, which is under the OG North Sea Transition Authority. Yeah, I'm getting a bit lost with them all now. So yeah, so I think the report is impressive. It's very substantial. I think what's probably the most interesting thing for me is that it does start talking about where the overlaps are in data from a renewables point of view with oil and gas. So I think it's good to see how much we could actually benefit from having a proper view across all the oil and gas, and then moving and transitioning to the renewables, where we are building large offshore wind farms, and as we move to floating wind farms as well. So I think that's really interesting. I think the bit that's going to be the most interesting is how you either incentivise, whether it's a carrot or a stick, to get people and organisations to get involved in it. I think it's probably going to be the crux of it for me.
Thank you, Angus. David, do you want to?
My name is David McCall. I'm the head of data and compliance at the North Sea Transition Authority, which many of you will know as the Oil and Gas Authority as it was. So whereas Angus has left the oil industry, I've now got a foot in the energy transition part of things, and also still in oil and gas in that the authority I work for are the licensing authority for oil and gas licenses, as well as for carbon licenses. My role there related to compliance is to make sure that organisations that should be reporting information to the North Sea Transition Authority do so, and that relates. Obviously, the audience in the room here is I'm detecting engineering-related, primarily companies, as opposed to subsurface related companies. Most of the stuff we're collecting is subsurface data, well data, seismic data, but also pipeline-related information and some of the other infrastructure information. So we've got a good insight into how companies are able to do that and how effectively they are. Obviously, we've got historical data going back right from the very beginning of the oil and gas industry, and therefore the challenges that were discussed in the last panel are all very, very apparent to me. I've worked in the oil and gas industry since, I left university, so that's, basically since the mid-80s. So, and I've worked in operators as well as, and I've only been in the regulator for 6 years, so I've got a good insight into that. Views on the strategy document. I've had sight of that. I was interviewed as part of the process of writing that strategy. It by nature has to be a very high-level strategy. I don't think anybody who reads it when it's published will necessarily read anything that surprises them. We all know some of the things we need to do. I guess the challenge is actually doing them, because they are incredibly difficult. And certainly in the last panel discussion, we had a debate on whether or not we go for a big OSDU type system, or whether we have smaller pilot skunk work type projects, the jury's out. It's very, very difficult. We all know the challenge, and I think it's the human element and the commitment that's going to be really very, very important. So things are very complex, and I guess we'll cover some of those things when we go through the questions.
Yeah, thank you, David. Ross?
I'm Ross McKenzie. I'm a partner with the law firm Addleshaw Goddard, based in Aberdeen. I've been working in the technology space for nearly 15 years now. I've advised a number of SMEs over those years who are interested in this space. I've helped a number of organisations on collaborations, industry technology facilitator, for example, where kind of my first experience in getting people together to achieve shared interests that they have, to achieve the sort of challenges that the sector faces. And the challenges that the sector faces have evolved every few years, haven't they? So my perspective on this will be, for the panel, really be to give my views on what I see clients looking at from the SME side when they're looking at investment and shared responsibility.
Thank you, Ross. Steve?
Okay. Oh, brilliant. Mike, straight away. My name is Steve Aitken. I'm the founder of Intelligent Plant, which is a company that looks at operational data, makes a thing called the Industrial App Store that allows anyone to analyse that data and bring value. And that's the same sort of streaming data Steve was talking about earlier. I am speaking at 4 o'clock as well, so I can speak more about it then and cut it pretty short just now. In terms of my views on the report, I think it does a really good technical look at what could be done, but could perhaps do more around legal and cyber and education. My perspective when I speak to clients is that whilst you can say you should be doing cybersecurity best practice, they're not really sure what that is, and they would really like a lot of help with it. And that's something if we could perhaps make easier for them rather than just saying your responsibility. Also around legal, and I think there's a tension between legal and open data sharing. So a lot of clients will have very sensitive data that would affect markets. They may not be able to share that data, and making it clear what can be shared and should be shared, so that they're not just immediately hitting tension trying to share everything might help. That's some of my views. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. So I think, David, if I can come back to you initially, you mentioned complexity at sort of the end of your introduction there. And, I showed the sort of data map, if you like, or data framework that we as a group looked at. And that by itself, just because its very nature is quite high level, but it was trying to look at where the overlaps were. So I want to talk about, could you give us a bit of your view around data complexity in the offshore sector and how that may impact how the industry could address some of the recommendations in the report?
So the matrix that you presented is very interesting. That really is one thing there that actually got to the crux of it, is that there are certain data types that have been generated by the oil and gas industry that are going to be very pertinent to the energy transition. And I recall seeing things like P&A or plug-in and abandonment of well information. And of course, we don't know how about well integrity. That's going to be a real issue for carbon storage. There's information there about pipelines. And so everybody in this room, when they're thinking of data, is thinking about data of different sorts. In the first panel, we heard mentions of PI and SCADA, and there's people here who will be thinking about, ops and maintenance data, or other people thinking about, seismic data. There's so many facets to the complexities. Obviously the vintage of the data, we are currently dealing with getting companies to provide us with seismic data literally from the 1960s. That data is not in a digital form. It was in paper seismic sections. We've had that digitized, and that was to help us do characterization of areas prior to putting out the first carbon licensing round that was announced very recently. So just by nature of the strategy here, I don't think we can look at things in that sort of, just one strategy covering everything, other than, we just keep focusing down on particular areas. I think it was Stuart in the last panel session was talking about, the difference between, demonstrating things in small cases and then highlighting those to management to get in the funding. And I think that sort of like pattern has been going on for many years now. And the challenge is keeping the momentum. Whether the people who are sponsoring those projects leave. So I think I do think it's an extremely complex area. Data types, vintages. There is no such thing as one company's process of doing this, because most of the companies operating in the North Sea at the moment in the oil and gas space are actually a mix of other companies, all the mergers and things we've had. So I just think we need to just understand this is going to be a very, very difficult thing to do. And the strategy focuses on, what the oil and gas industry has created that may benefit others. I just think we need to look at some of the areas that strategy is highlighting, and obviously keep on digging down and get very more specific on some of the issues that we have.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think working for NZTC, the idea of working and proving things in small cases, and then the challenge is scaling that up and using and adopting approaches, technology across the industry is a well-known challenge, and it's a perennial one that doesn't really go away. But yeah, thanks for that. It is going to be complex. The idea of the strategy, of course, sounds very defensive, but I'm really trying to take the view of showing that we really, the strategy is thinking about what we could do. It doesn't actually do it, and the challenges involved. And as David says, we need to focus on the things that need to be worked on, and that's essentially the next step. Now, Ross, I'd like to come back to you, please, because you were talking about your experience of working with a number of digital SMEs in the energy sector. So what do you see is relevant from the report, or the challenges from the report that is relevant to those sort of businesses in your experience?
Ultimately, SMEs are always looking for scalability, which can be incredibly challenging to achieve, and they're always really focusing on that first opportunity to get their idea to the market through usually an operator. That's their ultimate bullseye target. So we always need to keep that in mind in anything that's going on here for that segment of the market. And in the digital space, as I say, scalability can be sometimes perceived as a bit easier because technology can be scaled up when compared to traditional oil and gas services. But key here is understanding, well, what is their driver? And it's always investment. And investors want to always see a range of things which are relevant here, which I think will influence that buy-in. And from that part of the supply chain, because if they're going to want to invest time in this, we always have to keep that in mind, that there's always that underlying aim for their longer term vision of the business, whether it's a sale or a merger, whatever it might be. So everything I think that needs to be factored in here has to be around protecting their crown jewels. And that's often going to be the data and the learnings that they've understood through the work that's been performed with their customers. So giving away any of that, will need to have a really good reason to do it. And if they're giving away the crown jewels of their business, that's going to impact their ultimate ability to get investment in the future. So we're not going to get traction in that part of the sector. So we need to understand that, because operators will have a different interest. Some of this will be a little bit of a sideshow for them. Some of this will be the core interest of the SME that we're going. So we have to deal with that inherent tension. And a lot of it does come down to, well, what data are we talking about? Because there is a good motivation here. We're all trying to do things quicker and easier and understand risk and so on a lot more and better. So what I tend to see for digital players in this market are looking at protecting a few different parts of their business. So the first one is often just the platform that they use and the IP that's wrapped around that. And I don't think anyone here is saying that that's the sort of data that we would be expecting to be disclosed on a sort of a free and open basis, their secret sauce to how they do what they do. But the data that is ingested into that platform is probably more likely what we're talking about here. A lot of that will come directly from an operator. So some of that won't be as relevant for these sorts of companies that I'm talking about because they won't own it. It'll be just purely licensed to them. But the data and the learnings that they gain from using that data, we're often trying to achieve a protection for so that SME can grow their business and improve the platform, improve what they do, and go out to the market with that intelligence that they've learned. So it's probably sitting in that space that will be relevant here for this discussion. So key here for me is understanding what those crown jewels are, what needs to be protected and respected, and working out what data could be contributed for the common good of the industry. And I mentioned industry technology facilitator earlier, and it's the same sort of issues, trying to find those common goals, whether it's maybe health and safety data, for example, which tended to be one of the main focus areas in those good old days, and what NZTC are doing as well. So for me, it's all about that understanding what drives an SME and working out what around those edges can they contribute to this dynamic.
Yeah, thanks. Angus, lastly, I managed to bring you in. You've got experience as an operator and now experience with a generator. But I'm particularly interested in the impact of some of this on the renewables sector. So could you explain how it sort of impacts the plans for the future in that sector?
Yeah, I think the reality is a lot of significant infrastructure and work is going to be going on in the North Sea with wind farms, and Scotland has just increased that. And I think the scale people probably don't get. So like our Dogger Bank wind farm, so they're going to be the largest offshore wind farm in the world. Each turbine is 4 times the size of London Eye, and there's over 200 of them, and they're over an area bigger than London. So massive engineering projects, and all of those projects need huge amounts of data. So a big part through the whole life cycle, the development cycle, to actually put those wind farms in, there's a huge amount of effort to get consent to look at the seabeds, look at the environmental monitoring that's been ongoing. We've had really good success with, for example, using AI with machine vision to then identify and demonstrate impacts or no impact on the wildlife species in the area. So that's becoming a big thing. But just generally, through the development cycle, you've got huge amounts of data that you think, well, from an oil and gas point of view, of seabed information, from understanding the corrosion, metallurgy, electrical subsea cables, there's a huge amount there. And then you're going into the build, so how you're going to actually build these things, construction, materials to be used, all of that, and then into operation. You've probably got an advantage over oil and gas in that there's a lot of repeatability. So these are wind farms with 200 exactly the same turbines, and other operators will put in the exact same turbines. So how much you can actually share some data from the point of view of condition monitoring, looking at how you optimize those things, looking at weather data so you can understand what wind patterns are prevailing, how you predict the weather and the power output you're going to get across sections, and then how to actually manage that on the grid and provide supply. So I think huge amounts of work going on, and it's just going to be accelerating. And so that the data that's going to be needed during the development and build cycle is huge. And I think there's going to be a lot of data that's from oil and gas that's available. And then into operation, there's just a big opportunity to actually join it up and sort of leverage from the sort of Scotland and the UK point of view of we've got a really unique amount of energy around this island that we're going to be making the most of. So I think there's a chance to actually in a new industry like this, get off on the right foot.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I mean, and a lot of that depends on data sharing. We've mentioned it a little bit already, but I mean, Ross, perhaps, so it's pretty much a call for action for data sharing. And anyone who's known me for the last 3 or 4 years now, I've been banging on about data sharing and how we can get that do and what sort of technology and support. But I mean, as a lawyer, though, I guess there's quite a bit of risk mitigation. We've touched on it a little bit. So what sort of issues do you see coming up from a legal perspective on data sharing and maybe some of the mitigations that you could talk about for some of those issues?
A lawyer's never very popular when you talk about data sharing agreements because we automatically default to the worst case scenario. And that results in about 90 pages of legal text, which is not what we like to do, or I don't like, because some of it is a bit superfluous, and I think a lot of that comes from the so very many things that operators are expecting businesses to sign up to, because they're trying to cover every single eventuality, and that's just the nature of things. And ultimately, if this is going to be a success, we all have to get buy-in on a common data sharing arrangement that everybody signs up to. Where as many players in the industry have accepted the terms upon which this will be done, because the biggest issue will be liability for the data that's provided, and there's experience in that sort of sharing arrangements with very many of the different organisations that have inputted to this project. But so liability will always be probably one of the hottest topics. In my experience, when it comes to data and the services side, it can be quite difficult to negotiate those sorts of terms with operators because they're coming at it from a traditional oil and gas services lens. So there's a little bit of education that would be needed to make sure that we're all on the same page. And simplicity around that is ultimately what we need to achieve. Nobody's going to share data if there's something onerous on there in liability. We have to accept that. Nobody reads a book in a library and expects the author doesn't expect to be sued by the person because they followed what was suggested in the book. It's a bit like that. We need to achieve this sort of library mentality that everybody has to take responsibility and apply their own expertise if they're going to rely on that information. So the use of the data as well needs reciprocal sort of arrangements wrapped around it. So everybody's bought into the contribution and the use. And if everybody signs up to that bargain, then that should create the right environment for this. Where if I'm contributing, I will also respect that anything else I use will also come with it. And I suppose the analogy I kind of refer back to is a bit of the open source code software. I mean, that's been around for so long now, and the internet's opened up a lot of this, and it's the same kind of concept that people contribute free source code to enable to build software and applications, and what comes from that is that you can build applications a lot quicker. So it's these analogies I think are important to apply in this space that are perhaps not what we're used to looking at when it comes to oil and gas and energy services.
Yeah. So, Steve, you want to come in?
I'm thinking about Crane and Logic. Many years ago, they created standard contracts for oil and gas procurement that aren't often used, but it would be really great if they were. And if those things were extended to take into account the new things that have happened since in terms of data, IP, the concerns that are not necessarily covered to the operator's satisfaction, and probably the reason why they're not really following them, then I think that would be a great thing. So, starting from there and saying, let's get the industry together, let's try and get this agreed, and let's make it the standard contract, might not be in the lawyer's best interest in the long term, but definitely in the short term.
I'd rather not have to read a very long over-lawyered agreement.
Yeah, and at least it'd be the same every time, because it does take a massive burden on SMEs, especially when an operator turns up with a 900-page contract for a 5K job. It can be quite a burden.
Yeah, I mean, and that was discussed briefly, and sort of the traditional procurement process doesn't really help. And so how can we digitalize that to a certain extent? David, perhaps I could come to you. Is there a role for the regulators in supporting and even driving data sharing?
Yeah, there is. And just a comment on the previous one before I come on to that. So I think there's actually a lot of conservatism on the legal aspects of data sharing. I mean, Steve will remember a project that your organisation ran with the overlooked pay on the logs, and companies were asked to contribute log data, and there was months of delay while they all agreed the data sharing, when in fact the data was disclosable. It should have been reported to the regulator years before and should have been freely available to use. And so I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of, that sort of protection of those sorts of data. And so back to that original question of whether there's a role for the regulators, yeah. I think we have to differentiate here between what we mean by data sharing and how wide are we sharing that. And the job of this particular regulator is to have information reported to it. We hold that data for a period of confidentiality, and after that we disclose it. And that is something that it's always been the case that it's disclosable, but it was the mechanism for doing it was very difficult. So many of you might be aware of the National Data Repository, which in the beginning of 2019 became completely open to access. In other words, prior to that, it was a members club of about 70 different companies who were able to share the data among themselves immediately if they chose to do, but then after a period of time, it was about 3 or 4 years at the time, it would be disclosed among themselves. Access to other companies to that information was possible, but the mechanism through agents and through a financial mechanism was much more difficult. And now everybody in this room can access all reported well logs, all reported seismic reports, etc., completely free of charge. And that level of sharing after periods of confidentiality, where people's commercial interests can be honoured, I think is the way to go. And what we need to do is understand what information should be shared, kept for a particular period of time, and then disclosed for the greater good of not just the oil industry but the entire blue economy in the UKCS. Other regulators, I would be as bold to say as I think we're probably ahead of the game with quite a few of the regulators. There's lots of other information that really should be out there. There's no reason why it shouldn't be. Sometimes it is out there, but it's just very, very difficult to get hold of. We're trying our best to make it as easy as we can. Not perfect by any means, but we're certainly trying to do that. But this sharing among companies on an individual or collaborative sort of basis, to me there's only 2 reasons why a company is going to share data. One is there's a commercial interest to do it, and the other one is there's a regulatory obligation to do it.
Yeah, so it's good.
Yeah,
I think obviously there has to be focus on in terms of what it is, but the opportunity to change how that data can be made available to others, startup companies, academia, etc., is good.
Yeah.
Angus, if I could come back to you then, you've already talked a little bit about the overlap between the potential overlap for data sharing between oil and gas and the renewable sector. But perhaps you could expand on some sort of specifics a bit more, or some of the barriers that what would be needed to facilitate that more effectively and make that more available. So,
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think of like oil and gas, and it's interesting because I always thought that oil and gas was really collaborative, because for the vast majority of it, people didn't necessarily care about the data. Once you got away from subsurface, people were quite open about it. But then I think there's some good practice around things like CDA, where that has been a good example of the oil and gas industry collaborating. And then there's some really good knowledge around information management and document management and just asset intensive, how you handle data. I think would be really useful. But I do worry that, in my time in oil and gas, trying to get people to get involved in sharing operational data, learning, talking about sharing condition monitoring data, how do you build models by having data sharing was quite difficult to do. And I think it probably comes into your point of there's got to be a commercial interest. And I think that's the thing, back to the beginning of this about the report, is commercial interest doesn't mean you have to get paid for it, but it does mean that the effort you put in, you'll get a lot more back for the effort you put in. You know, when we had the Heads of IT Forum, it still runs, we used to always say, at the very minimal, the time you spend at the meetings should give you at least 2 or 3 times back in savings from learning from other people. And so I think that, how you ideally incentivize people to do that, rather than force them to do it, because I think the regulation is then a big stick that takes a long time to happen, and there's lots of things that need to happen. So I think, I think there's some really good practice in oil and gas around sharing data, and I think it's how you take that forward but it's all about how people are incentivized to do it. So I think that's going to be
Thank you. That's good. I think we're going to open up for questions to the audience in a minute. So if you could just start thinking about some questions, either about the report itself or something that's been discussed today. I'd just like to, perhaps Steve, if you could finish off this section, talking a little bit, is the industry, are companies within the industry structured in an appropriate way to try and take advantage or to deliver some of the things we're seeing in this? I know you're very much involved in developing skills and working with Data Lab and others, but perhaps you could just expand on some of that.
So I often find it interesting when you look at organizations, it's been alluded to previously today in terms of the IT ops dynamic. And I often wonder about what's a better structure. I don't know of one, but you can see the challenges with the current one. I often reflect on that and wonder if it's because we all think organizations are top down and not bottom up. So we tend to think we should tell them this is what you should do, that should come from the top, and then people should be told what to do. And people tend not to like being told what to do. They tend to like to be inventive, to show that they've brought something to the table and feel valued. So I guess trying to bring some of that to the organization so that the structure could be retained, but perhaps more could be delivered, might help. So allowing people the individual ability to bring something new and see that they're valued is I think, key. And it's effectively the same thing between companies when it's at a higher level. They all want to see that they've been listened to, that they've brought something to the table, and that means they've got buy-in. So I think that just needs to be done at many levels.
Yeah. Anyone else got a comment on that aspect? No? Good. Okay. I think we now have 15 minutes or so where we can answer any questions from the audience.
Yes. Just to expand on some of that. So we're obviously working on a number of initiatives at the Net Zero Technology Centre. And I'm just trying to think, we don't have any sort of regulatory power in any way to enforce anyone to actually follow any of this. And I understand some of the barriers that you've pointed out there is something that I've often experienced. Is there more that we could do to really articulate the benefits of data sharing? So in my experience, it's largely a hearts and minds exercise to try to win people over. But is there more that we can do to really articulate the benefit in this? And the other part is, when we talk about data sharing, do we need to focus more on particular data sets to actually reach the benefits for the industry? And what would they be, I guess, would be 2 questions there.
Okay, thank you, Blair. Who wants to? Steve? Yeah.
I think you're spot on in terms of identifying. If you ask someone, will you share your data with me? If I was asked that question, I'd say no, because I'd be worried about sharing my bank account details. I'd be worried about all my photos that they might not want them to see. And really, I think you're absolutely spot on to say, identify the things that people could share, would share, and would help to share. By pointing at those specifically and saying, if you share this, it'll have advantages for you to look like that, it'll probably kick off and you won't need to push it.
Yeah. Angus?
I can't help feeling that there's like a two-prong attack. So one is you start having specific examples where there's benefit for people to actually share the data. So you take an application like a condition monitoring or something where sharing things mean you'll get models. I think the danger with that is you end up going down a rabbit hole just adding lots of incremental things that might fizzle out after a while. So I think there's a bit of that to demonstrate a benefit, but I think there's also still, you need to have that bigger picture, like how do you sell a bigger vision of what it would mean if we had a proper data sharing platform? What's that do to the UK's ability to, move forward faster on renewables? So that I think it's just that balance. You don't want to keep it, you want to get some good examples, but then the danger of that is you just have, one pilot after another, and you lose sight of, I remember seeing examples of like cities, I think it was Singapore or others that decided, they just went on a big data strategy. They worked out what it would possibly mean if they shared the data and made it public. And so then they had that big vision, and then they just kept picking off. So all taxis shared their data, all public transport shared their data. Then the government would get that in apps to show people how, live data, and they linked it with ticketing. So it was just, there is a bit about how you keep that vision, I think.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, from my perspective, data sharing is, you've got to be able to deliver the value. So in other words, one of the statements, I think in the report talks about it's non-rival issue, typically data. So data, you can be using it as an organization to be solving your challenges, solving your problems. By sharing that data, actually you could be helping the industry as a whole without any necessarily detriment to your own business. So we're not talking about IP or something that might be commercially challenging. It's something to that, but you still got to be able to articulate that value and be able to see, well, by benefiting the industry, how am I also benefiting the future of mine? So it's about creating opportunities for an individual company. So as Ross says, I think, and Steve, the initial viewpoint is, no, data is our crown jewels, and we're going to hang on to that. And actually, in most cases, as David pointed out, sometimes there is no, actually, from a legal or regulatory point of view, should be open or available. Let's not say open. And in some cases, there really isn't that much of a barrier when you really look at it. But you still got to go through the process, and actually sharing data is a challenge, right? You've got to find it, you've got to sort it, you've got to put it somewhere, or you've got to open up your firewalls or whatever it is. And that's some of the challenges that we've looked at in terms of actions that we can take, and how can we mitigate or minimize the threshold or the barrier that you have to jump over to start sharing data. But I think this point is really key. You need to really understand what the value is in doing it. And it is quite a difficult thing to do. And it's not just, most people agree we should do data sharing, but how and why and how you're going to protect it is going to be really challenging. And I think we're looking for reports. Any other questions? Yeah, sorry, thank you. Oh, yeah, sorry. So we'll go with this gentleman at the back, and then we'll come to you afterwards. We'll go for this question. No, you stay.
Right, I'll just go.
We're going to take his question first, and then we'll come back to you. Sorry for the confusion.
Am I good?
Yeah.
Jeff Haley, I work for eServe. We're a digital twin specialist company across a number of different sectors. And part of my question was actually covered by Blair there, but I thought it's still worth kind of sharing a bit of an observation where we've kind of had really good examples of data sharing and bringing real value to our customers who are traditionally operators, and then kind of other examples where it's been a lot more difficult. And I think actually it's a bit more of in a generalistic sense, it's kind of, if we try and do something in the background and come together and make lots of partnerships and come up with what we think is a really good idea, and then go and try and push it onto someone, regardless of what that idea is, people don't like to be told something when they've already maybe got an idea of something else in their head. So the times where we've actually been really successful in sharing data, and by its very nature, a digital twin is sharing data. You are holding lots of information in one place for lots of different companies in the supply chain to come and access it on behalf of an operator to do some tasks, is by just being in the right place at the right time, in all honesty. So we've got something that works, the operator says, oh, we've got some really good ideas, can we do this, can we do that? And we've been able to have the ability to actually join those dots in the background for them. And then we've got a really good story to speak about. But if we then took that good story over to another customer, they'd be like, yeah, but we work with different companies, or we've got a slightly different approach to that. So I think I guess the point of what I'm trying to say is really just the observation of trying to deliver technology platforms that are really as agnostic as possible, that really can speak to lots of different systems, or can easily be linked up to different systems. So when the opportunity arises, it then makes it as effortless and as easy as possible to do, but not just trying to push your ideas on other people. So,
yeah. Okay, thanks, Jeff. I mean, I think you're right. There is a lot of so the reason why it's successful in those situations, because the operator sees that actually, okay, if I have a digital twin, and I can then use it when I'm working with many different parties to do it. So just by the very definition, you're starting to share data, but the clear value is there for the operator, and they can essentially enforce that to happen. So it's building on those sort of scenarios, highlighting them, and thinking, well, okay, what else could we be doing with this data that we haven't even thought about now is one of the ways to look at it. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So since you gave us the opportunity to answer your questions, I will use it. And reverting back to you, so I'm CEO of Earth Science Analytics, Tatiana Brandt. And if you think about data alone is a commodity, right? The idea is actually to move from data to actionable insights. And my company, we work a lot with big multi-client companies like TGS, CGS, PGG. And then you see the next level, in a sense, that when, for example, you use machine learning model to understand the data for Aitken, would you share it then for Wintershall Dea, for example? And that's another hustle, right? First, it's about we don't want to share data, and then we don't want to share our models. And it's where do we stop? And sometimes it gets a little bit frustrating. And I wish we as an industry would be more like our kids or teenagers, because they share too much probably, right? But I do believe that the secret sauce is not data itself, is not machine learning models, because look at Silicon Valley, what they deliver is actually machine learning models for free, right? I think the secret sauce and the IP would be actual domain expertise and ability to apply domain expertise first to data in order to create foundational trust, and then to validate the machine learning, for example, that it's credible, right? And that's where a company should be focusing on and using as IP. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, but thanks for that observation. I think, Ross talked about open source software, which, in the, I don't know, I'm showing my age now, but sort of the 90s and stuff, people will say, oh, no, we're not going to use open source. We're going to develop our own thing because, we have to open up everything. And the reality is today it's taken over completely on the back-end server IT space. The internet-driven standard protocols there. And if you look at machine learning, when you're creating a product around machine learning for a client to solve a particular problem, you're not generating your own model. You're essentially just taking the ones that are being proven and just using that. It's how you apply it to solve a particular problem. And I think what we're trying to do with these environments and this whole environment is set up the industry to make it as easy as possible for industry to benefit from collaboration. Collaboration, we heard about discussion together commercially in the first panel, but also collaboration around the use of data, making data more available. Stop having to solve the same problem multiple times. So if everyone's working on the same data set, or you pool data, you've got one data set that you might be able to use as a training algorithm for an AI, for instance, rather than every single company trying to solve the same problem with their own AI with a smaller data set. So there are some use cases, as Blair's pointed out, that we need to articulate better. But I think that's a really great observation, and thank you for that. We are at, we've still got about 5 minutes, so is there any other questions? Sorry, I can't see these lights. Okay, oh, that's fine. Oh, okay, so that's understood. I forgot we're stopping you from having your lunch. No, I'm going to insist on one more question. No, it's okay. Well, it just remains for me to thank you for the panel. So thank you to Angus, to David, to Russ, and to Steve. Thanks for you all for listening. And I'm happy. Unfortunately, I have to leave fairly shortly, but I'll stay for lunch. And if there's anyone who's got some questions around either the Net Zero Technology Centre or the data strategy, come and talk to me. Thank you very much. Thank you.